Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we are going to start a new chapter, local and humoral control of tissue blood flow. This chapter is mainly going to be divided into two sections, the local control and the humoral control. In the section discussing the local control, we will see that it is the tissues themselves that decide the amount of blood that is going to flow through them. In the section discussing the humoral control, we are going to see that how different hormones and ions and different secretions control the blood flow to different tissues. You must need to learn some definitions before we start, and these definitions are very important. They are often asked during vivas and also during your written exams. So the first important definition is of hyperemia. Hyper means increased and emia means blood flow. So increased blood flow to any tissue is known as hyperemia. There are two types of hyperemias, active hyperemia and reactive hyperemia. So let us see what active hyperemia means. Active hyperemia means increased blood flow to any highly active tissue. For example, if there is a tissue that is working more than normal and is very active, so its demand for oxygen and nutrients also increases. To meet this high demand, the blood flow to that tissue also increases. For example, when your muscles are very active during exercise, their demand for nutrients and oxygen increases, so the blood flow to exercising muscles increases. Same is the case with active GIT glands and your brain when it is hyperactive. This is known as active hyperemia. The second type of hyperemia is reactive hyperemia. So what is the definition of reactive hyperemia? Blood flow increases when a vessel supplying a tissue is unblocked after being blocked for some time. Blood flow increases to repay oxygen deficit caused as a result of blockage. So to understand reactive hyperemia and this definition, you can conduct a simple experiment. You might have also done it back when you were a child. If you occlude the blood vessels supplying your hand by tightly squeezing your wrist, and you keep doing it for some time, and then when you release the pressure from these blood vessels, you will feel a gush of blood moving towards your hand, and your hand suddenly becomes red because of this increased blood flow. This is known as reactive hyperemia. So let us now discuss the local control of blood flow to tissues. But before starting this topic, you need to know that why is it important to control the local blood flow to tissues. As you already know that the tissue when it is at rest does not require great amounts of blood or nutrients or oxygen. But the same tissue when it starts to work and becomes very active, its requirement for oxygen and nutrients increases many folds. So the same amount of blood which was being supplied to this tissue while it was at rest is now inadequate when this tissue is working. Also, if you supply great amounts of quantities of blood to a tissue at rest, this would be very ineffective and it would put extra load on your circulation. So you need to control the amount of blood to tissues according to their need, and this is done by the tissues themselves. That is why it is known as the local control of blood flow. So there are two types of local control of blood flow, the acute control and the long-term control. The acute or rapid control is responsible for controlling blood flow over seconds or minutes by vasoconstriction or vasodilation, which means this is the control which is responsible for maintaining blood flow within your body every second or every minute. On the other hand, we have the long-term control. Long-term control is the control of blood flow over a period of days, weeks, or even months. So it is slow to develop or slow to take over. Now let us discuss them in details. Let us begin with the acute control or the rapid control of local blood flow. First, let us have a general view of the factors that affect the second to second or minute to minute flow of blood within the tissues. So what is happening in your body is that whenever a tissue is hyperactive or has high activities, its metabolism increases. So the first factor that increases blood flow is high tissue metabolism. So any tissue that is hyperactive, its metabolism would increase. It would produce large quantities of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions and lactic acid and other waste products. Also, its demand for nutrients would increase. It would require greater greater quantities of glucose to break down and produce ATPs, and it would require greater amount of energy. So to meet all these demands, that is to provide extra nutrition and to wash away these waste products which are being produced in this tissue, the blood flow to that area increases. So to sum it up, the first factor that increases blood flow to a tissue is increased tissue metabolism. Tissue metabolism is indicator of a high activity of that tissue. जब भी कोई टिश्यू ज़्यादा काम करता है तो उसका मेटाबॉलिज्म इंक्रीज़ हो जाता है. एज अ रिज़ल्ट it produces greater concentration of waste products like carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions and lactic acids. Also, its demand for nutrients increases. It requires greater amount of ATP. So to meet this demand, the blood flow to that area increases. The second factor that increases blood flow to any tissue is reduced oxygen concentration in that tissue. So as you know, the tissue which is highly active, it uses up greater quantities of oxygen. So the oxygen concentration within that tissue decreases. Not only the oxygen concentration in that tissue decreases, but the concentration of oxygen around the tissue in the interstitial fluid also decreases. This decreased concentration of oxygen in the tissue and in the interstitial fluid surrounding it increases the blood flow to that tissue. So the other conditions in which there is decreased availability of oxygen or decreased concentration of oxygen in the tissues or in the blood, there is increased blood flow. The other conditions are, for example, high altitude. You know that at higher altitudes, the oxygen tension is reduced as compared to the oxygen tension at sea level. So what happens now is that the oxygen concentration within your blood decreases and your tissues cannot get enough oxygen from your blood. So to meet the demands of the tissue, the blood flow must increase to provide the same quantity of blood, same quantity of oxygen as is provided at sea level. So that is why the people who live at higher altitudes have more red or ruddier complexion as compared to the people who dwell on sea levels. Secondly is the condition known as pneumonia. In pneumonia, your lungs are filled with fluid and there is no adequate exchange of gases between the lungs and the blood. Now, the concentration of oxygen within your blood reduces and the cells cannot obtain adequate amount of oxygen. So, to meet their demands, the blood flow to the tissues must increase. In case of carbon monoxide poisoning, the ability of hemoglobin to provide oxygen to the tissue decreases, so the blood flow must increase to meet the demand. In case of cyanide poisoning, the ability of the tissues to use oxygen decreases, so the blood flow increases to the tissue so that more oxygen can be provided to the tissues. Two theories have been proposed to explain the acute or rapid control of blood flow. These theories are based upon the two factors we previously studied: increased metabolism and decreased oxygen supply or oxygen concentration. So these two theories, which were put forward by scientists, adequately explain the control of blood flow within tissues. The first theory is the vasodilator theory and the second theory is oxygen demand theory. These two theories are very important whenever you are asked to discuss the theories for the local control of blood flow. These are the two theories you are going to mention. So let us study both of these in detail. Let us first discuss the vasodilator theory. We are going to go about it step by step. I have devised this flow chart, and this flow chart is very helpful in understanding that what is going on and what is the mechanism of control of local blood flow through vasodilators, and it is also going to be easier for you to understand and even reproduce this in your exams. So please do pay special attention. What happens is, when there is increased tissue metabolism, as we discussed before, there is increased amount or concentration of vasodilators formed by this tissue. So when this tissue is hyperactive, it is going to produce large quantities of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions and potassium ions and lactic acid and another very important vasodilator, which is adenosine. So all of these waste products, this carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions, potassium ions and adenosine, they in themselves are very potent vasodilators. So when metabolism within a tissue increases, it forms large quantities of vasodilators like carbon dioxide, etc. These vasodilators act on metarterioles and they cause them to dilate so that the blood flow to this tissue increases. And when the blood flow increases, the demands of the tissue are met. It gets its oxygen and nutrients, and also the vasodilators or the waste products which were being produced are easily washed away. So this is the vasodilator theory. A very important point that you need to remember is that the most important or potent vasodilator in heart and skeletal muscles is adenosine. So this is a very common MCQ, and you must remember this, that adenosine is an important vasodilator for heart and skeletal muscles. So what is adenosine? You know that the currency of all of your cells is ATP. So when there is increased metabolism, this ATP is broken down into adenosine diphosphate, and this adenosine diphosphate is basically the adenosine we are talking about over here. So this adenosine, which is a waste product and which results from breakdown of ATP, acts as a vasodilator, and it is the most potent vasodilator in heart and skeletal muscles. Remember this is an MCQ point. Is another depiction of the vasodilator theory by this very beautiful image. You can see here that this tissue is very active and it is producing great quantities of carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions and adenosine. And what happens is these waste products, which are also vasodilators, they go and act on metarterioles, the arterioles that lie just before the capillaries, and they cause them to dilate, so large amounts or large quantities of blood can flow into the capillaries and provide these tissues with adequate nutrition, and also wash away their waste products like carbon dioxide, etc. And this is known as the vasodilator theory. Why? Because vasodilators like carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions are controlling the amount of blood which the tissue is going to receive. The second theory, which explains the control of blood flow to tissues, is the oxygen demand theory. The oxygen demand theory is also known as the oxygen lack theory or the nutrient lack theory. But before we start discussing this theory, I need you to revise something we studied a long time ago in the initial chapters of circulation. So let us revise it first and then we will move to this theory. Do you remember this organization that every capillary is derived from a metarteriole? Here you can see a metarteriole. Do you remember the other name which we used for the metarterioles? Yes, the sphincter vessels. Why are metarterioles known as sphincter vessels? The reason for this is that at the point where the capillary arises from the metarteriole, there is present a sphincter which is known as the pre-capillary sphincter. इसको pre-capillary sphincter इसलिए कहते हैं क्योंकि इस sphincter capillary से बिल्कुल पहले पड़ा होता है. This sphincter is not like a tap or a nut or a bolt. It is simply smooth muscle cells which are coiled upon each other. This stacking or coiling of smooth muscle cells form a sphincter which, when constricts, occludes the blood vessel and does not allow blood to flow through it. And when this smooth muscle sphincter relaxes, it opens up the lumen of the capillaries and allows the blood to flow from the metarterioles into the capillaries. Now, as I told you that the sphincters are made up of smooth muscle cells, so when they are constricted, they require oxygen like any other cell. अब ये भी तो काम कर रहे हैं ना. If these sphincters are needed to remain constricted, they also need oxygen to do this work. इन स्फिंक्टर्स को कंस्ट्रिक्टेड रहने के लिए ऑक्सीजन चाहिए होती है, क्योंकि ये भी बाकी टिश्यूज़ की तरह जब वर्क करते हैं तो इनकी भी ऑक्सीजन डिमांड इंक्रीज हो जाती है. सो व्हेन दीज स्फिंक्टर्स they get oxygen, they will remain constricted, and when the oxygen supply to these sphincters decrease, these sphincters are going to relax and open up. Now, where do these sphincters get their oxygen from? They get their oxygen from the interstitial fluid which is present around the cells. So it is from this interstitial fluid that these sphincters get their oxygen from. So if the concentration of oxygen decreases in this interstitial fluid, the delivery of oxygen to the sphincters would reduce and these sphincters would relax. Now, coming back to the oxygen demand theory, what this theory states is whenever there is increased metabolism of a tissue, the utilization of oxygen by that tissue increases. यानी कि जब कोई टिश्यू ज़्यादा वर्क करता है तो उसकी ऑक्सीजन यूटिलाइजेशन इंक्रीज हो जाती है. इट यूजेज अप ऑल इट्स ऑक्सीजन एंड द ऑक्सीजन कंसनट्रेशन विद इन दैट सेल decreases. Not only the oxygen concentration within the cell decreases, but the oxygen concentration of interstitial fluid around that cell also decreases. So what happens is that the availability of oxygen to the smooth muscles of metarterioles and sphincters also decrease. As I just told you, and we just revised that the arrangement of the blood vessels in this area is like here are the metarterioles and they divide into capillaries, and just at the junction of the metarterioles and the capillaries there is present a sphincter. These metarterioles and the sphincters, the walls of the metarterioles and the sphincter are both made up of smooth muscle cells, and they require oxygen to remain constricted. But where do they get this oxygen from? They get this oxygen from the interstitial fluid which is present around the cells. Whenever now in this case, when the tissues are hyperactive and they have used up their own oxygen and the oxygen from the interstitial fluid, there does not remain enough oxygen to be supplied to the smooth muscle cells of the metarterioles and the smooth muscle cells of the sphincters. So these smooth muscles relax, the metarterioles relax, and the sphincters relax. So what would happen? This relaxation of the smooth muscle cells of the metarterioles would result in vasodilation. Not only the metarterioles will dilate, increasing the blood flow towards the tissues, the sphincter will also relax, and there would be large amounts of blood flowing to these tissues to meet their demand of high oxygen. So this is the oxygen demand theory. Let me again explain you the vasodilator theory on this figure. So whenever the tissue metabolism increases, the utilization of oxygen by the tissues increases, and the concentration of oxygen in these tissues fall. Not only do these tissues use up all of their own oxygen, they also use up the oxygen in the interstitial fluid. And as you know that the smooth muscle cells of the metarterioles and the smooth muscle cells of the sphincters require oxygen to remain constricted, and they gain this oxygen from the interstitial fluid. And since the oxygen in the interstitial fluid has been used up by the hyperactive cells, so now there isn't enough oxygen to be provided to the smooth muscle cells of the walls of metarterioles and the smooth muscle cells of the sphincter. As a result, the metarterioles relax, and there is vasodilation of the metarterioles, and the sphincters relax, and increased amount of blood flows from the metarterioles into the capillaries, and the demands of the cells are met, because this additional blood this blood is carrying high quantities of oxygen, and this oxygen is enough to replenish the demand of this hyperactive tissue.